Joining us now, Abigail Spanberger, Congresswoman Spanberger representing the 7th District of Virginia. That's the central Virginia area. She's a Democrat. She's one of the ones that got elected in the Democratic wave, one of the so-called moderates that won a Trump district, defeating Dave Bratt there by 6,000 votes. She will be up for re-election in 2020. It'll be a hard-fought battle, no doubt. There's already one Republican running. I can't think of her name, Tina, somebody from somewhere. But Abigail likely to face off with a Nick Freitas, House of Delegates member, who I'm convinced is going to run for that seat and be the nominee. But that's just my predictions, and of course my predictions are always right. Joining us now, Abigail Spanberger, Congresswoman. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, John. It's great to be with you.
So here you are in Congress, and you got elected on a platform to get things done. You're a former CIA. You're a mom. You're not used to sitting around and wasting time. But so here we have today, coming down the pike, you have H.R. 6, an amnesty bill, which is going nowhere. McConnell's already said it's DOA in the Senate. Basically, the bill is giving amnesty to everybody. How do you stand on that, Congresswoman?
Well, so I would love to reiterate your point. I love to get things done. I have at times been frustrated by what happens in Congress, and at times been very heartened by what happens in Congress. We have passed a number of really good bills, really strong bipartisan bills recently. Just the week before last, we were back in our districts last week, but before that we passed the Secure Act, which was overwhelmingly bipartisan. And it allows people to use their 529 savings, for example, on apprenticeship tools and equipment, so really expanding access to the sorts of programs that will allow people to have economic opportunity across what their chosen job, their job choices might be. But to address the bill that you're bringing up, I think it's incredibly important that we have individuals who are in this country through no fault of their own, who came to this country when they were children, who are in our schools, who are working in our hospitals, working in our schools, working as police officers in our military. And it was under executive order under the last administration that they were given certainty and the ability to stay here. And I think that it's Congress's responsibility to actually legislate these things. I don't think it's appropriate for everything to be done by executive order, and so I am pleased that we as a Congress are going to be giving certainty to these individuals so that, they can do things like buy houses, and they can know that they're going to be able to stay here, and they've lived their whole lives as Americans effectively, and that they actually get to start on the path towards doing that.
All right, so it sounds like you're going to vote in favor of H.R. 6.
As it stands now, yes.
Okay, thank you. Do you think there's a crisis at the border, Congresswoman?
I would say that there is a tremendous challenge. Some might call it a crisis, and so I'll call it that. We have people who are fleeing violence in their home countries, and we do not have the ability to process everyone who is arriving here filing for asylum. What I think is the real problem is that we're actually not really being honest about how we address it. And I think that that's a problem on both sides of the aisle. I think that always putting together immigration and border security is troublesome. If we're looking at immigration and the causes of immigration, and there are so many different buckets, there's agricultural workers, there's high-skilled workers, of course there's those who come here fleeing violence and looking for asylum. But we need to look at the infrastructure that exists. And so, we don't have enough immigration judges to process individuals. We also have pulled back significantly, and this year's budget from the White House cuts non-defense national security spending by about 24%. And so, part of the challenge here is what changes have we been making in recent years, and what could we be doing to ensure that people don't want to come here? I've heard colleagues talk about our counterterrorism fights as, we fight on other people's soil so the fight doesn't come here. When we're looking at the challenges of humanitarian issues, people don't want to flee their countries, when people aren't forced to flee their countries, that's a benefit to everyone.
These people in the southern hemisphere has been taking our money. You have no idea where that money goes. No one knows where it goes, and it goes to the elites down there. And to think that we can just, if taxpayers in the U.S. just fork more money over and give it to elites, and Guatemala somehow is going to solve the problem. I mean, come on, nobody believes that.
John, let me be very clear. I don't think we should just be forking over more money. I don't think we should ever be spending any money without a real significant strategy. And that's really, as somebody who I count myself as very fiscally responsible, we have to be looking at the places where we're actually making investments. And instead, we are always, as a country, particularly in recent years, been reactive. We're reactive in the way we spend our money. And when you're reactive, you end up spending a lot more money. If you've got a plumbing problem in your house and you don't address it and all of a sudden all of your pipes explode, that is so much more expensive than if you had gone out and taken the time, made a plan, gotten your pipes fixed early. And I think it's maybe a ridiculous analogy, but I think the point is well made that we need to be looking at things preventatively. We need to be creating strategies, and not one-year strategies, appropriations bill to appropriations bill, but truly long, concerted efforts to show and demonstrate leadership in a way that impacts our national security positively and our role in the world.
Leadership and long-term thinking, I think you're in the wrong body for that, because I haven't really seen any of it on either side of the aisle. I mean, that has got to be the oxymoron.
Wouldn't it be great if we had a Congress and a government?
It's like, let me get elected
plans?
to Congress, and I'm looking for long-term thinking and leadership. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I appreciate the attitude. But here's the disconnect. So we have the month of May or something like that. We've apprehended 100,000 people. I mean, that's and they're saying they're only getting 1 out of 3, right? That means 300,000 people have tried to come over the border. I mean, you times that by 12 months, it's an entire city. I mean, you can't sustain this. And so then when I look at H.R. 6, and it's another amnesty bill, you can couch it and call it what you want. It's amnesty. And so it's basically, okay, we're getting 300,000 a month coming up from wherever to get in the United States, and now we want to give an amnesty bill, which is the further incentive to come in the United States illegally. I mean, make that logic work for me.
And I understand your frustration, but I think that the challenge here is looking at the population that is the dreamers and the DACA recipients. So these are people who came to this country as kids, and I recognize that part of your argument is that people who are coming over the border now may or may not have children with them. So are we going to be having the same conversation in 25 years?
Right.
And I would argue that that's why we need comprehensive immigration reform, because we need to get this figured out now so that we're not being reactive in 20, 25 years. But the DACA recipients that we are talking about are people who came to this country as children. There are strict parameters on this. This bill has strict parameters related to criminal offenses and criminal history to ensure that it's individuals who came to this country as children under very strict guidelines. This is the country they know as their home. They've gone through American schools. They're in college. They've joined the military. They work in law enforcement. They work in hospitals as nurses and doctors and within our community. They're adding to our community because they are a part of our community. And so I think that it's important to say, like, these are individuals who are working and living as Americans already here in this country. They're adding to our economy. They are part of our communities. And so I do think that it's incredibly important that we give them certainty, that we give them the ability to do further things that one can do when they know that they may not have to leave and be deported to a country they've never, ever known, such as buy a house, invest in property, make longer-term professional goals. And I do think it's important. Now, that doesn't negate the fact, going back to your point, that we need to be discussing, well, what is our longer-term plan? We do have, thousands upon thousands of people who are coming to this country and fleeing Central American violence and instability. So what do we do there? But that it is a very different group of people, a very different bucket of needs and concerns when we're talking about the DACA recipients. And I recognize that you're talking about sort of the precedents that we set. But we have long set a precedent of welcoming people in this country who live here, who, give back to the economy, who are parts of our community. And that's exactly what this bill seeks to do. And that's why I support it. But it's not to the exclusion of talking about other challenges that we see related to immigration.
In a reasonable situation, that's a reasonable position. But when you've got 300,000 people trying to cross the border illegally, that we know of in a month, I think you have to take this a lot more seriously, because you're really right now looking at an open borders situation. And so the president says, look, Mexico is not cooperating with us, so I'm going to put these tariffs, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25%. I'm going to bring them to the table. I'm in favor of that. What about you?
So I'm not in favor of putting taxes on American consumers, which is exactly what tariffs are. And I'll raise this question.
Well, illegal immigration is costing us $1 billion a week. I mean, there's the tax right there. It's $1 billion a week. So now you're afraid of paying another 5 cents for a 6-pack of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, and we're paying $1 billion a week in taxpayer funded to support the illegal. So I think that's a straw man argument.
Then it goes back to the question of being reactionary versus proactive. And my question, to which I would pose to the president, is what does he want Mexico to do? Because, again, here we need to have a set strategy. Mexico is challenged by some of the similar challenges that we have. They have individuals who are arriving at their border, passing through Mexico in groups of people seeking to arrive at the United States. And so, in fact, Mexico should be one of our strongest partners in addressing this issue because they are also impacted by it. It is impacting them in a similar, though not the same way, as it's impacting us. And so, but rather than making Mexico our maybe strongest partner and saying, how do we address this issue? How do we help in the region? How do we stabilize things? How do we work in favor of our own security so that we do not have thousands of people crossing through Mexico with the goal of entering the United States? And instead, we are creating an adversarial relationship with the country that should, in fact, be
they're not cooperating.
Our closest partner in this. And the people who pay for it are the American citizens. And when we go to the store and when we go to the shops, we're going to see that increase. And it's a tax on everyday Americans, but it isn't to benefit anything because there isn't a plan and there isn't a strategy and there isn't a stated goal.
The strategy is to bring the Mexican
pay attention.
Congresswoman Spanberger, the strategy is to get the Mexican government to the table, and as soon as the president imposed these tariffs, and by the way, we have a $350 billion trade deficit with them going their way. So they're looking at this and saying, oh my God, if this thing ever got to 25%, we're going to lose $90 billion. All of a sudden, they fly a contingent to Washington to try to negotiate with the Trump administration in order to get action at the border. So they're just not opening up this tubular pathway and letting people come in. And so this argument about we're upsetting our ally, I heard that same argument when President Trump was trying to renegotiate NAFTA, and oh my God, we're upsetting Canada, and he got it done, and now we have a bit better deal with USMCA. So I've already heard that argument.
We don't have it yet, John, but I see your point.
Well, you have to pass
it. My question is, and my background is national security. My background is in diplomacy, and certainly I believe fully that we are, we have a position unlike any other country in terms of negotiations. And I don't see it, and I wasn't privy to all the conversations, but at what point did Mexico say, we don't want to discuss this issue? At what point did Mexico say, we're absolutely fine with people walking through our country desperate and fleeing on their way to the United States? That has never been asserted. Mexico has not been complicit in this, and I'm not
by their
Mexico,
actions.
But I don't think we needed to levy tariffs and make put prices and the increases.
Well, I tell you what,
the cost of consumer goods on Americans to get them to come to the table.
He did the same thing with the Chinese, and he got them to the table. I mean, he did the same thing. He called Xi's bluff, and he put the tariffs on China, who have been ripping us off for 5 decades, and he got them to the table, and he's going to get Mexico to the table. They have to do something. They're doing nothing. John. It's all talk.
We've got soybean farmers across Virginia and the rest of the country that are impacted. They're losing markets.
Do you have a better plan?
And now the U.S. government is giving them bailouts, which I think are wholly appropriate, but they're not. They cost a lot of money.
Because if you don't have a border,
at the same time, if we have soybean farmers who are literally losing their market share because when you haven't sold your crop in a year, the Chinese are going to go elsewhere. And this is a concern that came up at one of my town halls in Amelia County. I had a farmer stand up and say, I don't want taxpayer welfare. I want to not lose the markets that I've worked for decades to build. And that's what's happening to me.
Well, you know what? So they've been ripping us off. They've been ripping us off for 50 years. They've driven down labor. They've dumped goods in the United States.
John, I just introduced a bill focused on 5G network and basically working to protect our own intellectual property, trying to ensure that U.S. consumers are protected from potential Chinese hacking, protected from spear phishing efforts. And it was a bipartisan bill. I partnered. I found 2 Democrats to join with me and 3 Republicans to join with us. And that bill's making progress. Because we recognize, and I serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I serve on the Agriculture Committee, so the confluence of sort of where China exists as a threat is something that's ever present to me in the committees where I serve. And so I 100% think that China is a threat. And part of the reason is they're a threat is they have a long-term strategy, and they're willing to be patient, and they're willing to invest, and they're willing to challenge us not just this year, but 5, 10, 25 years from now, which brings me back to the point we discussed earlier, which is we as a country need to start being more proactive, pursuing longer-term strategies, and being less reactive. And going back to the soybean tariff, China continues to be the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt, and so we've started a trade war. We've impacted some of our farmers. We have given bailout dollars, which I think we've done rightly so. But in the end of the day, we're continuing to be indebted to the country that we have started said trade war with.
Well, that's because we have transit.
There's a lot of things the government does that doesn't make sense, and that is certainly chief among them, in my opinion.
You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network. We're with Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, Democrat, former CIA. She represents the 7th District of Virginia. That is the middle of Virginia. She defeated a Republican incumbent, Dave Brat, in 2018 as part of the reason that the Democrats are in the majority. She'll be up for re-election 2020. Congresswoman Spanberger, let's get to AUMF, authorization for military force. Let's see. I've been on the air 9 years, okay? I've been asking for a new AUMF for 9 years. All I get from people is lip service. Everybody's on my show, Republican, Democrat. Oh, yeah, they're going to do it. Barbara Lee comes on my show, puts it in appropriations. 9 years later, it's never been in the well one time. When are we going to get a debate on a new AUMF?
I mean, the answer is I don't know. I will say thank you for all of your advocacy, and I'll say it's going to take political courage. One of the things that I have learned since I've been here is part of the reason, and just I'm sure your listeners, having spent time listening to you, are aware of the AUMF, but the AUMF was put in place right after September 11th. It allowed us to take military action against the perpetrators of 9/11 and those who gave them safe harbor. It was very, very specific. Over the years, it has been expanded in its interpretation, and the presidents, and we're talking George W. Bush and then President Obama and now President Trump, have been very comfortable using the AUMF as a reason to take military action in circumstances that I would argue, and I think most people would agree, are not wholly related to the actual incident of 9/11. But the challenge here is there are not necessarily enough lawmakers who want to be taking votes on whether or not we send people to Yemen or whether or not we send people to Somalia or whether or not we, engage militarily here or there. And so this AUMF it becomes very, very convenient if you have a Congress that doesn't want to take votes on things that are difficult. And I believe that's the point that Barbara Lee has made at various different points. I do think that we have a critical mass of people who are finding this as a common discussion, and I have talked on the floor with folks who we have nothing in common in terms of our ideology or the things that are important or the things that we prioritize. But when it comes to discussing Article 1 of the Constitution, the constitutional powers given to Congress, that's where we find agreement. And so I actually think that there is a bit of a movement afoot. I am a bit of an optimist, so I think it might be more, powerful. We'll see in the coming weeks to actually address this issue, because the bottom line is we have individuals who are entering the military now who were born after that AUMF was put in place. We have a generation of people who don't know anything other than war. We aren't having a public debate about it. The American people aren't engaged in that conversation, because when Congress makes a decision to send service members off to war or into harm's way, it isn't just about Congress taking that responsibility. It's about that being debated in the public sphere. It's about the American people being aware of what's happening. And for so many years, those who are not serving the military and do not have friends or family serving the military have been able to go about their daily lives and relatively unaware, relatively disconnected from the fact that we continue to have service members dying overseas under a very, very old and outdated authorized use of military force. And I think that is wrong. And I think, you and I agree on this. And I will say there was a movement afoot by, if you're familiar with the group Concerned Veterans for America, which is typically a very Republican voting
CVA
organization, and Vote Vets, which is typically a very Democratic voting organization. Those two entities have joined together. They don't agree on much, which they, very openly acknowledge, but they agree on the fact that we cannot have these endless wars. We cannot continue to work under this authorized use of military force from September, from this right after September 11th. And they were on Capitol Hill 2 weeks ago, really actively engaging with people across the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans, kind of from end to end, to talk about this issue. So I do think it's becoming ever present. I do think that it is something that people are pushing. And we have more veterans now in Congress than we have in recent past. And so with a lot of the new members who have experienced war, who have spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're very attuned to this. And so I hope that they will continue to be a strong voice for this. And certainly given my background on counterterrorism, I feel that I have a strong voice in recognizing what we need to continue to fight terrorism, but where we should also expect and require that members of Congress do their job and uphold the Constitution and ensure that they're the ones responsible for those powers that fall very squarely in Article 1 of the Constitution.
Well, the coalition that you just mentioned is unique because, look, it proves that you don't have to agree on everything to agree on one big thing. That's number one. The second thing is, Abigail, I just want to debate. And what the leadership on both sides of the aisle are petrified of because of the money that flows in from the military-industrial complex is having a debate on these wars that we're in because they can't win any of them. I mean, you look at the fact that we're still supplying the Saudis and the UAE in this war in Yemen. It is horrific. If that ever came to the floor, it would get beat by 75%. Yet the money keeps flowing in, the arms keep going, the bombs keep going.
Remember, we had a vote, it seems like forever ago, I think it was about a month and a half ago. We passed, we had a vote.
Yeah, but it was a procedural vote. Yeah. If you had a new AUMF, that wouldn't have been a procedural vote. That would have meant something because they would have pulled the funding for it, especially for your look, just the other day on one of the biggest backers, the lobbyist of the UAE that was also a Trump supporter, I can't remember the guy's name. He was a fundraiser. Now we find pornographic stuff in his email. I mean, all this stuff, it would all stop if we just had a debate on these wars. Okay, I'm almost out of time. I know you've got an initiative on prescription drugs. What is it?
Yes. So my focus on prescription drugs is greater transparency and greater competition. So we actually 2 weeks ago voted on a couple bills that would add on the competition side. The bill that I introduced is a transparency bill. So many people assess that one of the contributing factors to the rising cost of prescription drugs is the fact that there are pharmacy benefit managers, so the in-between between the pharmaceutical companies and the patients and the prescribers. And there are vouchers and rebates and kind of essentially kickback-style funding, but there is no clarity, no transparency in where this all occurs. And so my bill is a pretty simple one, pretty straightforward one, and it would require that those rebates and those incentives be made public. It's already information that's being provided to the government, so it's not creating any undue burden on these companies, which I state for the record, not because I necessarily have an opinion on that, but it is about making this information public so that individuals and researchers and patients and those on prescription drugs can have the ability to understand what are the pricing gains that basically go into the final cost of their drugs. And the bill passed unanimously out of the Ways and Means Committee about 2 weeks ago with bipartisan support, unanimous out of committee. So I'm really excited and very proud of that. And we're hoping to get a full floor vote on this bill pretty soon.
Hopefully you can get bipartisan backing on it. I appreciate your doing that. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment. Congressman Abigail Spanberger, Democrat, 7th District of Virginia. That's the Central Virginia area. Abigail, thanks for being with us. I really appreciate the time and your candor. Thank you so much.